We'd like to give a special thank you to Pure Project for hosting the Society of Barley Engineers. Thank you.
All right, so let's give Andy a big round of applause. He will be telling us about serving the perfect draft.
This is great to get the applause before I do the presentation. You can take it back later. First of all, I want to wish you guys all a happy Libation Day. Or was that Liberation Day? I don't know. I think it was Libation Day, right? Libation Day, right? Happy Libation Day, everybody. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about serving the perfect draft and all the things that go into that. And so what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about carbonating beer, serving draft beer, line balancing. You guys are going to ask, well, what's line balancing? Well, we'll see. Temperature control, draft beer systems, and vessels and pouring beer. So let's get started into it. If you guys have questions along the way, go ahead and ask them. We'll also have some time at the end. We can go through questions also. So
just remember to stick your hand up so I can come around with a microphone.
Oh,
please.
yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, this picture right here was. You'll see some pictures in here that I plagiarized, but you'll see also some that I took myself. And the ones that I took myself, they're labeled at the bottom. And so this one was from Von Trapp Brewing in Stowe, Vermont. If you get a chance to get out to Vermont, this is a. I was thinking it would just be kind of a joke brewery because it was, these are the people that did Sound of Music and what do they know about brewing? But actually, it was a really good bona fide, German brewing place. So you should get there if you can, if you get a chance. So how many of you guys have a carbonating system like this at home? Yeah, that's great. I'll be right over to carbonate my beer. Whoops. Yeah. So yes. No, I came across this when I was looking at carbonating beer, and it just looks pretty crazy. But rest assured, it's going to be a lot easier for you to carbonate your beer. You don't need this system right here. Most of you probably already know a lot about carbonating beer, but when you take a step back and you think about what we're doing with beer and carbonating, and we compare it to other carbonated beverages, beer actually has a very wide range of carbonation. And so if you look at, sodas and you compare it to champagne and, champagne's pretty bubbly, but it's got a tighter range. And if you just look at where most of the macro beers are, they're really in a very tight range. And then craft beer is like, 1.5 to 5, that's kind of the range that you'll see for volumes of CO2. And we'll be talking, when we talk about carbonation, we'll be talking about volumes of CO2. And you probably wonder what is a volume of CO2. And there's a definition that's listed right here. It's specified as liters of dissolved CO2 in a liter of liquid. That's what the volume means. So we'll be covering some of those numbers. One of the interesting things is that there's not really any quantitative standard for beer style carbonation. We always like to look to BJCP guidelines for the standards. And when you look at BJCP for carbonation, you'll see things like, well, it's low, or medium high to high, or you'll see moderate to high. I'm not sure what moderate and medium, what the difference is. Or you'll see sparkling to still. And you're like, well, that kind of covers the whole base, doesn't it? So, it's kind of, you see all these things in here, and really the only thing you can determine from it is that, yeah, they're kind of, you would expect for a German wheat beer, it would be a little on the higher side, and for British ales, it'd be a little on the lower side, and everything else is somewhere in between. And so here I have some other sources that actually list numbers, like Brewer's Friend, BYO, and a place called BevSense. Just to give you some comparison, but even in those numerical ones, there's actually some difference. And so it'd be fun to have some kind of a project where you would actually go measure CO2 in a lot of the commercial samples and give that feedback to BJCP so they could update their guidelines. That would be a kind of a fun project to do. Maybe something Society of Barley Engineers could take on sometime. Anyways, The other thing that's really important to this discussion is this carbonation chart. I think you've probably seen this one. In fact, you've probably seen this exact chart with these colors. It seems to be everywhere. And in the colors, I know you probably have trouble reading what it is, but the blue is what they call undercarbonated. The white is lightly carbonated. The green is, again, I'm going to use this word, moderately carbonated. And then the red is high carbonation. And so I think the main takeaway from this really is that if you look at the pressure required to get, say, just look at the green band, if you wanted to be in the green band, and you think of yourself at being at a your typical refrigerator temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit, then you're looking at something on the order of, say, your 2.6 volumes. You're looking at, in the green band, you're looking at 12 psi. No, I'm sorry, at 38. Yeah, 12 psi at 38. But if your beer was to warm up to 65, then you're looking at 26 psi to get the same amount of volumes. And so that's something that's going to be really important in draft serving systems. Why you want to keep a good temperature control over your product. Okay, I already moved to the next slide. Carbonation methods. So carbonation methods. There's really three main methods to doing that. Spunding, which is basically retaining enough CO2 from the original fermentation to set the carbonation level. And so, various reasons why you might want to do that. You could save money on carbonation. You might not want to introduce carbonation that might have some impurities in it. And so, you might feel like that's something that you want to do. Sometimes when you're using particular yeast, some yeast will give off some off flavors like sulfur and things like that. So that may be, if you were just retaining all the original carbonation, it might be a reason why you might not want to do that, and to sort of scrub the beer out with some fresh CO2. The other one is bottle conditioning, which we've probably all done. And that's a good way to get the carbonation level. And it's actually surprisingly accurate with you control the amount of sugar that you're using, and that sugar is going to ferment out, and you can calculate exactly how much carbonation that you're going to get. But the main method that people are using in draft beer serving systems is forced carbonation, and that's what we're mainly going to be talking about today. Here's a picture I took at Pure Project in Carlsbad. And I just love going there on a sunny day, taking a picture with the palm trees in the background, and then sending it out to my relatives out in wintry lands. All right, so let's talk about forced carbonation methods. So there's the normal method, which is to set the CO2, using that chart that we showed you, to set the CO2 at the desired pressure, wait 5+ days. The beer is going to condition during that time anyway, so you might want to wait for a period of time. That's sort of the normal way to do things. But then, as homebrewers always want to do things faster, or sometimes commercial brewers want to do things faster too. So there's faster ways. The fast way is to set the CO2 at a higher pressure and leave it overnight. So I do this sometimes where I might set it at 30 or 40 psi, leave it overnight, and then in the morning drop it down to the pressure it's going to be at, and you can shave a few days off of the cycle by doing that. If you want to go even faster than that, you can use the shake and roll method, which is one of the ones I think Sean Bush uses this a lot. You take the keg and you can shake it, roll it around there with the CO2 hooked up, and you can saturate the beer with the CO2. And if you want to go even faster than that, then get yourself a carbonating stone, and that's a lot of times the way the professionals carbonate their beers. So. This is a picture I took at Bierstadt, and this is a slow pour Pils. And so one of the things that's unique about this beer, other than the fact that you have to wait a very long time for them to serve the beer, is that it has this sort of pillowy top on the beer. And every time you get that beer, every time you order that beer, you'll see that same pillowy top on it. So I think that's pretty cool. If you guys get a chance to go out to Colorado and visit Bierstadt there, you should do that. So let's talk about draft serving. And again, you're probably going to know some of this stuff, but I guarantee you're probably not going to know all of the stuff that I'm presenting today. So hopefully everybody's going to learn something. So let's talk about what it takes to serve beer properly. And it's really a balancing act. So there's three things we're trying to achieve. One is we're trying to maintain the carbonation level. We're also trying to make a desirable head. Everybody wants to have a certain amount of head on there, not a big foamy glass, but not basically a flat glass either. And then, especially for commercial establishments, trying to dispense it at a reasonable time, because, well, I guess time is money, So that's the balancing act that we're gonna be talking a little bit about. And when we look at the kegs and we say, okay, if you look at that chart and you say, well, for the temperatures that we're going to be at and the volumes of CO2 that we want, we're somewhere in the 10 to 12 psi range. But when we want to dispense a beer out of the tap, the beer needs to flow out of the tap at less than 1 psi. Otherwise, you're going to have tremendous foaming. And so therein lies the need for flow reduction. So this is kind of the basis for why we need to do that. So there's various different flow reduction methods. The first one I'll talk about is low pressure serving. And I don't recommend this, but I think you could get away with it in a pinch. I've seen this, a lot of people do this where they just go, oh, well, it's coming out foamy, so let's lower the pressure, and suddenly they're at 5 psi serving their beer. Well, the problem is then the beer you're serving at a lower pressure than the beer is saturated at. So guess what happens to the carbon dioxide in the beer? It comes out. It comes out in the lines, and then you start getting foam from that. And so people can't understand why they're getting a foamy beer when they're turning the pressure down. And that's because they don't have the line balance, and they're not serving it at the right pressure. And so, like I said, you could do this in a pinch. You can slow it down. But usually what it means is that you'll see the first, it's been sitting for a little while at that pressure, the first beer that you serve will come out foamy, and the second beer will serve better. And that's one of the ways you can, indications that when you look at your system and you look at how it's pouring, if you see that the first beer doesn't pour as good as the second beer, then you probably don't have your system dialed in properly. So that's something that a good way to pay attention to that. There are also these flow control faucets, and I've used them, but I don't know if anyone's had any luck with these. I have not. I think that my thinking on this is that I see some head shaking here. My thinking is that you're trying to reduce the pressure over this very small, distance, and so you're causing foam just from that process of doing that. The professional way of doing this is what we call line balancing, and that is basically you want the pressure to drop over a longer period, through what the actual beer serving line is. And that's important because it's sort of a gradual pressure reduction through the line. And so, that will tend to benefit you in reduction of foaming. Everybody with me so far?
Hang on.
We got a question coming in here.
Hey, just further on the line balancing piece there, have you found and obviously it's temperature dependent, but an ideal line length to kind of offset?
We will be covering that. I love the hat, by the way.
That's a great segue, right?
Yes.
Great segue?
Great segue. I love the hat there. Notice the Padres hat? Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing that out here. No, we are going to go into that in detail, so thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so let's talk about line balancing. Now, these guys right here, I don't know which brewery this is, but they definitely need to make sure their lines are balanced because they got a pretty complex brewery going on right here. But first, let's take a little look at understanding the serving pressure. And so when you are not serving your beer, and your system will come into equilibrium, and it will all come out to that, basically to the pressure that you've got your regulator set at. But as soon as you open the tap up, the pressure is going to drop. At the tap end, it's going to be, coming out of the tap, it's going to be basically atmospheric, or what we'd say 0 psi. And so there's a big drop that occurs over the length of the line right here. So just, you need to understand that because everything else that we're going to look at kind of goes through that process. So basics for line balancing is that first of all, the keg remains at the carbonation pressure. So whatever you carbonated your beer at, you want to serve at that same pressure. Or you can go to higher pressure, but you can't go to lower pressure. If you go to lower pressure, that's when you get outgassing. Okay, so then ideally you keep all of your beer and your beer lines at the same serving temperature. So you've got constant temperature for everything. Your CO2 doesn't matter. Your CO2 could be in the cold or it could be out of the cold. It doesn't matter. Okay, but when you get to the beer side, you want that to be all the way cold, and ideally it comes right out of the tap there and it's cold right there. And you're going to get your pressure reduction from using line restriction and also from gravity. Some places they might have a cellar that's down low and where they're pumping the beer up there, and that gravity can actually make a difference in what you need to select for your line length. So primarily what we're looking at is we're looking at the length of tubing, and we're also looking at the diameter of the tubing to get to the right balance. So before we get into all that, the details and the nitty-gritty on that, I just want to point out that as a home brewer, we don't have to necessarily target the same flow rates that they do in an establishment like Pure Project here. This establishment right here, people are going to get upset if they don't get their pint served pretty fast. So the industry standard is to go at a gallon per minute, which is about 7.5 seconds per pint. That's the industry standard to say that's how fast you want your beer to flow. But I think if you set up a system that way, you don't need to do that for home brewer. If you take a few extra seconds and the beer serves a little better, or you waste a little bit less, then that's a good balance. So I think if you notice a lot of times when you go to professional breweries and they're serving their beer, they might open the taps before they put the glass under, or they might let it flow over the top to get you to the right point. And you may not want to do that with your home brew. So if you've got a little bit more time, my suggestion is you run a little bit slower. My suggestion is 10 to 12 seconds per pint. That's a little bit slower than the industry standard. Now we get into, it wouldn't be Society of Barley Engineers without going in through some calculations, right? So we got some calculations. Don't be afraid of the math here. It's not that complicated. We have multiplication and subtraction. We didn't include any division. So, no, actually there is some division, sorry. Sorry, there is a division. So, but no logs or anything like that, or contour integrations or anything like that. So very simple. And so the interesting part to me is when you look at the tubing, so everything has a specification for the restriction. And the interesting part to me is if you look at the vinyl tubing, 3/16 inch ID has a restriction of 3 psi per foot. And if you go to a 1/4 inch, it's 0.85 per foot. So, there's a big difference in here. Probably for most homebrew systems, you're probably not going to use 1/4 inch ID tubing. You're going to be using 3/16 inch ID vinyl. So I'll give you an example right here of this calculation. If you look at, supposing we have an IPA and we want it to be carbonated at 2.6 volumes, and we're going to serve it at 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, if you look up on that chart, you'll find out, that we need to be at 11 psi in order to make that happen. So now, if you run the calculation, you say, okay, your carb pressure is 11 psi. We've got an elevation of, say, 2 feet. We're going to go from the keg up to, where the tap is. Let's call it 2 feet. And so you're gonna have that. That's going to be 1 psi from there. And so you're basically 10 psi divided by the 3, which is the restriction, and you get 3.3 feet. I mean, I don't know anybody who has a 3.3 foot, line on their serving system. I don't. Mine are longer than that, but that's because I can run at a lower speed, and that seems to be more appropriate for a homebrew setup. So anyway, so that's how you would do the line balance calculation. And they do this calculation, it's set up this way, it's kind of set up for the industry standard pouring. So if you run this calculation, you're going to get something that may not be exactly what you want to run at. And so what I'm going to suggest to you is to do something in a different way. And I don't know that this has ever been really presented anywhere else that I've seen, but this is something that I've done with my system, and you can do the same thing. And what I call it is empirical line balancing. And so what I would say would be it's an iterative process where you would dial your draft brew system in to the exact flow rate that you're looking for. And if you do it with this process, it will factor in everything that you've got. It'll factor in your brewing hardware, all your tubing, whatever gravity, not gravity, whatever height differences you've got and differences you've got from gravity. That would be factored out in the calculation. And so the way you would do this is you go through and you first have to figure out what your serving pressure is, because everything comes back to that. So if you know what your kegs are going to be carbonated at, how many volumes you're going to carbonate at, and you know what temperature you're going to be at, then you can say this is the serving pressure. We want the serving pressure to be the same as the carbonation pressure. So that we're talking about home draft systems now. So then what you do is, I'm assuming you're going to use 3/16 inch line, and you set up your draft system with a keg of water. There's no reason to waste your beer on all this stuff, and start with a line length that's longer than you're going to need. So you can start with a line length that's say 15 feet or something like that. You're not going to use 15 feet in your final configuration. Connect up your CO2 to your water keg and run it through all of the hardware and the taps and everything that you got on your system. And what you do is you fill a pint up and actually time it. Figure out how much time it takes for the pint to go through. And then you can take your line, cut a foot off of your line, and time it again. And you can go and you can just reduce the line until you get it to the point where you get the flow rate where you want it to be. So, yes. Question from Kurt here.
Hey.
No need to holler, Kurt. We got a mic for you.
What do you do with all the 1 foot lengths of tubing you have left over?
Kurt's asking the important questions.
Yeah, I'm just starting to think about all the things I might be able to do with that. But I don't know. Maybe I don't know, Kurt. I love the question. I don't have a good answer for you, though. So to me, I ran this study, and I'm going to show you, because we're engineers, I'm going to show you what my system did right here. This is a Gamelin Brewing Keyser draft setup. Set up for 36 degrees Fahrenheit and 2.6 volumes. So basically that means serving at 11 PSI. And so for serving at 11 PSI, and I started with 11 foot length and ran it all the way down to a 1 foot length. So, and you can see how the change in the flow rate occurs, basically water fill time. And I basically selected a 6 foot length because it's somewhere around the 11 second mark. And so for my system, 11 seconds. If you had a tap that worked a little differently, had some restriction built into it, this would sort of account for it. You might come up with a different number than I do. Or if you're serving at 38 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 36, then you would run this at 12 PSI, something like that. So anyways, that gives you an example. I also ran some additional testing here. I ran basically the flow rate versus the keg pressure. Because we say, oh yeah, we're going to do that we're going to serve at 11 PSI. Well, we know that we don't always serve at the same exact pressure. Sometimes there could be variation in your regulator. There could be some variations in there. So what I did is I said, okay, well, let's see what happens. What's the effect of changing the pressure, the serving pressure now. Supposing I'm going to use that 6 foot line that I came up with, a 3/16 inch ID, and now I start changing the pressure anywhere from 6 PSI to 15 PSI. And you can see that especially at the lower pressures, there's actually a big change in the flow rate. And then it starts to level off a little bit. And fortunately, in the range of say 10 to 12 PSI, we're plus or minus 5%. And so that's really good news. That means that if you were to target 11 psi, then your regulator, it's hard to read the gauges. Maybe you're at 12 or maybe you're at 10. You're still going to be within 5% of the target flow rate. So that's really good news. And then the last thing that I went through and measured was what happens with the fill level of the keg, because we know that gravity plays a role in this. And if my keg is full, then there's going to be a higher flow rate than if it's empty. Well, does it really make a difference? And the answer here is you can probably see that the curve is trending upward, but it's, I would say, negligible. Don't worry about the fill rate of your keg when you're calculating your system. So the main thing is really to run the study and set the flow rate or the restrictions or your line length based on getting the flow rate that you want, and you don't really have to worry too much about small variations in the pressure of your regulator and the keg fill. So that's all sort of good stuff. Does that make sense to people? Do people have any questions so far? All right, we'll keep moving on. We'll move on. We're going to talk a little bit about temperature control. This is a picture I took at Maui Brewing, and I don't think this brew pub is still open. They've opened up a new one in Lahaina. But when I went there, it was really cool because you sat around the bar, and everyone knows Maui's a pretty humid place and real warm, and so you're in the bar area, and they serve you this nice cold beer. And the cool thing is they've got this frost generator that runs around the bar, and you can actually set your beer onto that frost generator, and it will keep your beer cool, in the time that it takes to drink your beer. So I thought that was really cool. So anyways, temperature control is not only important for when you're consuming the beer, but also important for when it's going to be a paramount importance for draft serving. And you've seen that chart. I showed you how the pressure changes based on the temperature pressure in your keg. And so here's the chart again. And just to point this out is that when the beer warms up, more pressure is required to maintain the same carbonation level. And vice versa, if you were to let the beer warm up and you didn't put more pressure on it, then your beer is going to start outgassing because of the temperature change. And so something that we need to be aware of. And so they give some examples of environmental changes that could occur. And so, for example, if you're at the 36 degrees Fahrenheit and 11 psi, that's where your system was at, and you had your beer charged to that level, and then the temperature went up on the beer from 36 to 40 degrees, say, then the beer is now going to require 13 psi instead of the 11 psi to maintain the saturated CO2 in the liquid. Otherwise, if you don't have that pressure there, then it's going to start outgassing. Now, maybe the outgassing will be minimal if it's just a small temperature change. Maybe you'll be able to deal with it. As the temperature change gets larger, though, this is something you really have to worry about. And when you go to the festival, you're going to see a lot of beer systems where you can look at the tubing and you can see the bubbles in the tubing before it comes out to be served. That's when you know it's basically outgassing. So that's that example. The other example is if we were to actually raise the pressure on the regulator to compensate, then we raise the pressure to 13 psi. Well, now we don't have to worry about the outgassing, but we're going to get a 13% higher flow rate because the pressure is running higher. So now you're going to see how this balancing act can really cause problems. If we let the beer, say we have a tower on the beer, and towers are notorious for not having great temperature control in them. Supposing the beer in the tower faucet is at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, well, what'll happen is the first pour will come out foamy, and then the beer will go through the line, and the beer will actually, chill the line up, and so your second pour will come out better than the first pour. if you have your beer on ice, say you're serving the beer on ice and it's in a tub, and then you have some tubing that comes out to a tap over there. It could be a picnic tap, or it could be to another system. Then your beer in the ice bath, because it's now 32 degrees, only requires 10 psi to maintain the carbonation in the keg. But the problem is when the beer is coming out into the line, then it comes out at ambient temperature, and now you're going to be outgassing in the lines, not in the keg, but in the lines where it comes off of it. And you'll notice the first pour is foamy, and and as that beer comes through the line, it chills the line down, and so the second pour will come out much better. So one trick you can do at the festival when you go out there is, if you're figuring out what beer to order, is watch when someone else orders a beer. After they order their first beer, you order that same beer that they ordered, and you'll get a really good pour. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to point out is we're mostly talking about temperature, but also about altitude. This is something that when you go, say, going up to Big Bear or something like that, you're serving beer up there. Well, the beer, that atmospheric pressure is lower. And so basically the pressure differential is larger. Your beer is going to flow out faster than it will at sea level. So if you carbonated the beer at sea level, and say you went to 4,000 feet, that's not even Big Bear yet, but 4,000 feet will, ambient pressure will be lower by approximately 2 psi. So the beer will flow approximately 13% faster, and it'll be higher carbonated than it would have been at sea level. So, these are things to think about if you're transporting beer, up into altitude when you're serving it. This becomes a little bit more challenging. So, any questions about that? Kind of, yes. Justin's we got a mic coming, Justin, for you.
So it's good to get flow beer quickly so you can pour, but if you just used like EVA barrier tubing, which is a very small diameter, and a long length of it, would that solve most of the problems serving it like a festival?
Yeah, we're going to talk about how you can do that. But yes, if you have a longer tubing length, you have more restriction, but you need to run at higher pressure in order to make that happen. And so typically, like a place like a Pure right here, they don't want to, at their facility here, they're not going to run at high pressures in there, because what'll happen is they'll leave it set up that way, and it'll start carbonating the beer at higher carbonation. But for a festival, you can do that because you can set it up that way. You can push the keg out at a higher pressure, push the beer out at a higher pressure, and then at the end of the festival, you need to bleed off the pressure on the keg if it didn't get fully drained. If you're going to bring the keg back, it didn't get fully drained, you should bleed the pressure off of it so that you're not taking a 25 psi extra carbonated beer home with you. Mike had a question.
Given the same, in a Keyser, you had several kegs with different styles of beer, some that may have more wheat, that tend to have more head on them. Will they foam more than, assuming the same pressure, the same temperature as an IPA or a lager?
Yeah, the answer is yes. If you're basically at a higher carbonation rate and you serve under the same conditions, then it will foam more. So you might want to have some taps that have longer length on them. That's one way to get around it. If you want them to serve at the same, you can serve them at the same. If you want them to serve at the same pressure, you might want to have longer length longer length on them. But if you want them to serve, the other way is that it can serve out faster. If you keep it at the same system, it might serve out faster. But then you could end up with more foaming from that. So, yeah, so it becomes challenging. But so what I would say would be that when you do your line balancing is that you line balance it, and if you're going to sort of carbonate all your beers the same way, then you could just replicate that among all your lines. But if you're going to have some that are going to be higher carb systems or maybe even lower carb systems, you might want to balance it a little bit differently. I have a keg on my Keezer that is for a seltzer, and that keg, I will carbonate it at 30 psi, so it's much higher carbonation in there. So I have a much longer line length that I have connected up to that particular tap that serves that seltzer, and that's exactly for that reason. All right, let's talk about draft beer systems now. We can get into the meat of this. This is a system that Lauren and I built for Stone for their draft setups. Yeah, they did the artwork on there. It was pretty badass artwork, but we did all the tech around the serving system to make sure that they could serve beer for their festivals. Let's talk first about the commercial draft beer brewing systems, because that's a good lead-in to the systems that we'd use as home brewers. And there's really two types, is direct draw and long draw. And I've separated direct draw into that with a tower and that without a tower. So the best system really for serving beer is if you can keep everything at the same temperature. And that's what most of these breweries are doing. And like you can see it here where the taps come right out of the cold box. That's the best way. And if you're building a system at home, you can think about that in terms of how you want to build it. But sometimes, you like to have these really nice looking towers and things like that because they're really cool. And it also allows you to face the person you're serving when you're pouring the beer. And so if you have a really good cooling system in there, then perhaps that can work really well for you. But most of these systems, the cooling system is not as good as what you would get just coming straight out of the cold box. And so that's basically a direct draw with a tower. They call these direct draw because you're coming straight off of the basically the source of where all the cold box is. Then for some places, like you'll go to some places where they might have like 100 beers on tap or something like that. Well, they've got their cold boxes remote or further away from where they're actually serving. Then you would have what they call long draw. And the long draw system, they're going to have, basically a much bigger diameter tubing, and it's going to run from a long distance. And then they have to actually keep the tubing cool, so they'll have cooling in all the tubing lines also. So it becomes a much more complicated system. And the other downside of it is also that you've got a lot of liquid in those lines. So if you just go there, if you go to one of these places where they've got 100 beers on tap, you're probably getting, and they got a long draw system, you're probably just getting, a pint of beer that's sitting in the line there. And who knows how many days it's been sitting in the line. It's not coming from the keg. Unless you see somebody that orders 6 beers or something and you go, hey, I'll have one of those. But yeah, so I'm not a big fan of the long draw systems, but I know, sometimes that becomes a necessity for places to do it that way. So what do we do as homebrewers? Well, there's really two ways you can look at this for a home draft system. One is you build something out of a Keezer, or you build a Keezer system, which is basically taking a freezer and converting it to refrigerator temperatures. And the other way is to get one of these kegerator systems or build a kegerator system. And they both have their advantages. The Keezer system will end up with better temperature control because first you have freezer grade insulation, but also you have everything down in the cold area. You don't have a tower or anything coming off of there. If you don't have a tower coming off, if you just have the taps coming right out of the cold box, then you're getting really close to what they're doing here, at Pure Project and at a lot of other breweries. If you have the kegerators that are a little bit more convenient for loading because you're not lifting and putting things into them, and they're also compact. Usually those kegerators don't have as many products as you can put on them, but sometimes you can get those kegerators that where you can put a lot of them on one. But usually they're made for 1, 2, or 3 type corny kegs. cleaning the systems. Justin's asking about cleaning the systems, and not sure that it's really too different for either of these for cleaning them. I mean, you'd want to run line cleaner through the systems. I don't know if you're talking about cleaning the lines or cleaning the actually inside of them, because the inside, yes. So is a good point that if you're looking at a keezer and you have to clean it, you have to get inside of the keezer, or you have to be really tall so you can lean down there and clean stuff, whereas the kegerator is a little bit easier to clean the inside of it as well. So those are kind of the two basic systems, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail around that. But first, let's talk a little bit about portable systems. And this is kind of real pertinent because we go to a lot of these festivals and we're serving beer, and we've got many different kinds of serving systems. And I basically divide it down into 3 categories. One is a cold box. So basically that's to emulate everything that you see here at Pure, but put it into a box. And maybe instead of using refrigeration, we're using ice. But the same concepts for everything. Everything stays cold. And then the coil jockey boxes, in those systems, you're keeping the keg warm and you're driving it through the jockey box to cool the beer down before it gets served. And the cold plate ones are basically doing the same thing, only they use a plate, an aluminum slug basically that's got stainless steel tubing that runs through it, and they use that to chill it down. There's some advantages and disadvantages to each of these, which we'll get into, I think, on some of the next slides. So let's take a look at a cold box example. And this is a system right here that I built where I have a 1.75 gallon keg. I've actually put the CO2 inside of there. It doesn't need to be in the cold box, but it's convenient to carry the whole thing all at once. And you just load it up with ice. Even the regulator, I have a regulator on there, and I've stripped the gauges off of it. You don't need the gauges if you're never changing the settings on it. So I've stripped that off just to make it more compact. And the system, because it's at 32 psi at ice temperature, it's really serving at 10 psi. Your really serving pressure is 10 psi. And so this shows you an example of how, well, your regulator would be at 10 psi, your keg's at 10 psi, and then your tubing drops it down so that you can get the right flow rate at the finish. And so you'll see some tubing wrapped around in there. That is where we're doing the flow reduction. Let's talk about another cold box example, and this one's with the tower on here. This is basically what we use for our homebrew setup at Schiff. And we put the beer into tubs, and the tubs are at, ice cold, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And then they're inside of a chamber. And the idea is that, over time, that chamber should cool down because it's got everything in there. It's got ice and things like that if we don't open it too often. And so I don't know what the exact temperature in there is, but let's assume maybe it's 45 degrees inside the chamber. And then we go into the tower, and the tower is air-cooled from the chamber. But the thing is, so that's going to be at a higher temperature than the chamber is, so maybe that's 60 degrees. And so you can see how the beer is sort of starting out cold but warming up along the way. And depending on how often you pull off of various different beers, that will tell you what temperature the beer is actually pouring out at and how much foam you're going to get. And so so there's some, obviously you can see some, although the bar looks amazing and has some issues with the way it performs because of how the temperature is being controlled. And so that's a compromise I think that's been made to get to this bar that's really convenient, really nice to serve off of. So let's talk about jockey boxes now. This is ones, a lot of you guys have these jockey boxes at home. And the typical jockey box would be with these coils right here. And typically they would be 120 feet of coil. And the idea with the jockey box is you actually drive the keg at a higher pressure than the beer is saturated at. So notice how, you drive the keg at 25 psi. And so what that does is it allows the keg to warm up to, pretty high temperature, maybe around 65 degrees, before you'd see any outgassing. And you drive it through, and the pressure doesn't drop on the keg until it gets into the cold side. Maybe it drops a little bit because maybe there's some height difference or something like that of where you're serving it. So there's some lines that go in to the cold area. But once you get into the cold area, that's when you really want to drop the temperature or drop the pressure down. And so it drops in that coil, and then you can serve the beer out there. And so the advantage of this is that you could keep the beer at ambient. So whatever your cold box is, which has those coils, can be much smaller. The high pressure prevents the outgassing, but you have to make sure that at the end of the festival, or end of the time of use, if you're going to bring this keg back, you need to bleed that off. Otherwise, the keg's gonna come back. Even if you just disconnect it, there's in the headspace is 25 psi, and then it gets shaken all up. You're gonna saturate all the CO2 into it by the time you come home. So something to keep in mind if you're serving on one of these systems. They also have shorter length coils, some 50-foot ones, things like that, that can make a compromise between size and weight and all these things. Typically, these things might have 2 products in a jockey box. Another sort of disadvantage of this is that in the lines, there's enough coil in here that in the lines there will be over 2 pints left in the line. And so as homebrewers, we don't like to waste anything. To see 2 pints left in the line, it's something that we need to consider when we're looking at our draft systems. So let's talk about doing this with a cold plate. With the cold plate, the first cold plate, at least the one that I got, was designed, and a lot of them are designed to be served at the serving pressure, 12 psi, something around there. But the problem is they don't have enough restriction in them, and so you can't drive them at the 25 psi that you would want to drive like at the coil ones at. Now Andre has one that will drive at high pressure. So there are versions of that, and I think if you were to use the cold plates, that's what you would want to use. But let's just, for this example, let's look at if you're driving it at lower pressure. Well, the beer is going to outgas, because once you're at 12 psi, it's great when you're at 36 degrees Fahrenheit, but you warm up, say it's at 75 degrees or something like that. Now it's going to just start outgassing, and there's nothing you really can do about it. So what happens is the first beer that pours will be foamier than the second beer that pours. The advantage is, though, that in the system is that there's just a few ounces left in the line. So when you clean up and things like that, you don't feel like you're wasting a lot of beer. Now let's talk about, what happens if we make a high pressure jockey box with a cold plate. And in this case, the system that I had, I just routed additional tubing after the cold plate as a restriction. Andre's cold plate is better because it already has enough restriction built into it. And so if you're buying a new one, that's what I would be looking for. But if you have a cold plate that just doesn't have enough restriction in it, you can add tubing afterwards to get to the restriction level. So in this case, I think I have about 15 feet of tubing on each line. So there's 4 lines, 15 feet, there's 60 feet of tubing just running through this thing. And so it becomes a little bit of a challenge to figure out how to route all that tubing so it can be organized and not just be a big old mess. But that's what's routed there in that picture right there. And so the advantage of this is you can run it at the 25 psi. You don't get any outgassing. The beer comes out perfect every time. And when you look at what beer might be in there or what beer is left or wasted at the end, it's less than a half a pint, because the coil sizes are smaller than the coils that you buy typically are like the 1/4 inch ones. And remember how I showed you that the 1/4 inches ends up having a lot less restriction. And so those 120-foot lines have a lot more beer that's actually in the line. Those ones are designed for, like, you could open the tap up and leave the tap open, leave it open and just pour pint after pint. So if that's the kind of serving you're doing, you probably want to be looking at those coils. But typically we don't do that. We might have multiple products and we're pouring a few ounces at a time, and then it stops and rests, and then a few ounces. And so this is maybe a little bit more appropriate system for what we're trying to do. You can put more taps. That's the advantage of the cold plates. Is the one that I have here has 4, but there's cold plates that have 6 products on them and things like that in one cold plate. And so that's pretty cool because it's a really compact system when you can do that. And it's surprising how little ice you end up using for a system like this. All right, so we're nearing towards the end of the presentation, but I want to talk a little bit about vessels, or what we drink out of, and the pouring process, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about some of these things. And so I think we'll go into that in a little bit of detail. First, let's talk about beer vessels. I call it a vessel because you could want to call it a beer glass, but sometimes we use plastic and other things like that too. So the main thing is that whatever vessel you're going to use, it should be clean and devoid of cleaning residues. I can remember we used to meet at Stone Brewing, and one time we were trying a lot of their beers there, and we couldn't figure out what's the smell in this beer. It smells chemically. And we tried the next beer. That one smells chemically. And it took us a while, but we figured out that the glassware was, had this bleach-type chemical smell to it. And it was basically getting into all our beers. So we needed to rinse the glassware before we could use it. So, this kind of thing happens. So if you're running your glasses through a dishwasher or whatever you're using, whatever detergent gets on there, does it keep a residue on there, or does it come off easily? Then the vessel that you're serving into should also be cool. A lot of times when we go to the festivals, how many times have you been out there pouring beers and somebody hands you this glass that's really hot? And you're thinking, I'm going to pour a beer into this really hot glass? And so, of course, if the beer warms up, we already know that. The beer warms up, it starts foaming. And so if you pour it into a hot glass, guess what's going to happen? Your beer's going to foam. So one thing that you can do is if you rinse the glass with cold water, that can solve both problems. It can solve the problem of the glass being too warm, and also solve the problem of any residues that might be on the glass, or maybe even whatever was the last beer that they tried. You want to try your Pilsner, but they had an oatmeal stout in the glass before then. Okay, it's going to be really hard to taste the beer when you've got that other beer that's on top of it. So that's an important thing with the glassware. Let's talk about whether you should be using glass or plastic. And then there's no reason why you can't use plastic, but just keep in mind that the plastic has more surface tension, and so you'll get more foaming with the plastic. Sometimes that's a good thing. I mean, we were at competition judging, and they typically give you plastic cups because it would be too much of a logistical challenge to use glass. And you can end up getting a little bit more head retention on the plastic than you would on glass. So sometimes that's helpful for some beers. Thin glass. Let's talk about glass thickness. And so I went to HomebrewCon when it was in Baltimore many years ago, and Corey Majors and I went into a Spiegelau session. And the deal was if you go into the session, you're going to take away the glasses for free. So we're like, well, that sounds like a great deal. And one of the things that the guy did there is he poured a beer, the same beer, he poured it into a regular pint glass, a shaker glass, and he poured the same beer into one of the Spiegelau glasses. And you taste the beer side by side, and you swear they're different beers. It was so crazy. Corey and I were just looking at each other. I can't believe this. It felt like it was a magic trick that they were playing on us. And so it makes a little bit of sense if you look at like the wine industry. They've gone to these really nice thin glassware, and then we still have some of these clunky glasses that we're using in the brewing industry. It's really kind of a crazy thing. So it does make a difference if you're using thinner glassware. There's less heat capacity. So when you pour into the glass and the glass is warmer than the beer that you're pouring into it, then the beer warms up. And and it can change the carbonation level. It can change the way that the beer tastes. So it's just something that you should be aware of when you're choosing the glassware that you're going to use. Also, the shape of the glass. The shape of the glass can affect the flavor as well too, and also affects how you can pour into them. And so if you want to talk about the most difficult glass to pour into, it's these long, skinny glasswares like the Pilsner glasses. And so hence the whole idea with the slow pour pills is that you got to fill the glass up, you got to let it settle a little bit, and then fill on top of that to get that glass filled. So things become a lot more challenging when you're trying to fill that type of glass. Justin.
So you're saying we should use frosty beer mugs?
That's a great point. Don't use a frosty beer mug. So ideally, your beer mug would be the same temperature that your beer is at. That would be perfect. So if it's warmer, it's gonna foam. But also, the whole idea of sticking your beer glass into the freezer, you guys probably know this already. You take the beer glass out there and you pour into it, and it foams up, and you're going like, what happened? It's cold. It should be okay. You know, and so you're getting a lot of that frost that's basically causing foam. And it kind of makes a little sense if you just think about you want everything to be at the same temperature. That's what you should be driving towards. Keep everything at the same temperature. Keep your beer at the same temperature, your glassware, all these things at the same temperature is ideal. Now we can't always live in that world, and so we'll pour into glassware that's a little warmer. That's okay. But if your glassware is hot, then you probably need to do something about it. All right, so that's glassware. A couple more slides, and then we're going to jump into questions. And what I wanted to talk about now is the pouring process. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen people do this, when I say the wrong way. And so when you have a tap, the tap is should be either open or should be closed, not anything in between. Okay, so when you're normal serving, you open the tap up there, you should open the tap quickly. Boom, the tap is open. Boom, the tap is closed, like that. If you have the tap in the middle position, it foams. So you keep in mind that when you're serving, and like festival serving, what I like to do is I like to literally just flip the tap open and then flip it shut when I get to the right fill rate. Start by pouring the beer down the side of the glass. If you're doing a 2-ounce pour, well, that's a different story. But let's assume you're pouring a pint. Start by pouring the beer down the side of the glass, and then take a look at how the pour is going. If you're getting plenty of head, then try to keep it going that way. If you end up where you're not seeing a lot of head, then you can come into the middle and have it drop down the middle to try to generate that head so you can get the right head retention. If you still don't get the head retention even after dropping it in the middle, then you can go to that middle position and you can actually put a foam top on your beer from doing that. So that's basically the proper way to pour. If you're doing festivals and small pours, I typically just go right down the center of the glass and just flip it open and flip it closed real quickly, and that seems to work real well. So we'll go talk a little bit about the hand pumping and nitrogen, just to be inclusive of this. We've talked a lot about doing things with carbonation, but there's a whole nother beer category, which is cask beer, which is served and pulled with a hand pump, usually from a cellar that's down below, and it's kept at cellar temperature, cool but not cold. And you would you would hand pump it up. Basically, introduces oxygen into the beer, and you serve the beer to somebody that way, and you get this sort of frothy beer with this nice foam top on it, very low in carbonation because you've basically stripped a lot of the carbonation out when you frothed it up. And that's great, especially if your beer is fresh. I was just out in London, and I can't tell you, maybe about 50% of the time, maybe more, where you could tell that the beers were heavily oxidized, and sometimes when they weren't, and they were just fantastic, So it all depends on how often they're going through those kegs, how good that's gonna taste. The nitrogen draft systems, those systems are designed to sort of emulate that hand pulled beer, and so the idea is that with carbon dioxide, it will saturate into the liquid, just like we talked about. Nitrogen won't saturate into the liquid. It will just remain in the headspace. And so the idea is that you can put a higher pressure on your beer without carbonating it more. And that's really useful when you're trying to push the beer out, harder and get this sort of a shearing action in the tap, in the special taps that they have. They can allow the this creamy, Guinness foam to hit, and that cascading, the liquid cascading down feature that you see on some of these draft pours for nitrogen systems. And so that's what nitrogen system is really all about. We're not going to cover that in great detail, but the thing to know about it is really that mix of gas is designed so that you can get the CO2 carbonation that you want in there, but get a much higher pressure to force the beer out. And you're using nitrogen instead of oxygen, and so that nitrogen is an inert gas, and so that will tend to preserve the beer much better than oxygen, which is reactive. So I think that's all I've got right here. Any other questions? Get the mic coming here.
Okay, because I've served with you before, and I've seen your setup for the cold plate. I know you're specific on, is it ice versus if there's water inside there as well? Can you kind of go over that and how it affects pouring?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I probably should have covered that in here, so I'm glad you asked that question. And so the recommendation from the manufacturers is that if you have a coil system, to just leave the water in there for the coil system, and that, because you still have cold water. This thing's running through ice cold water, but for the plates, the recommendation is that you drain the water off, and so that the ice comes down and still sits on top of the plate. And I think the way to explain how this works is if you guys have ever gone swimming in a lake where you're up on the surface and then you dive down deep and you can feel all the cold down there, you can get sort of pockets of different, you get temperature gradients as this thing works. And so what happens is in a coil system, the coil runs for a particular length up the whole thing. And so your coil is going to be probably in contact with the ice when it gets closer to the top. Whereas with the plate sits down at the bottom, and what happens is the ice will float on the water. The ice will float on the water, and you can get the water pocket between the ice and the cold plate can actually start getting warmer, and you get this gradient between the ice and the cold plate, and then it doesn't work as well. And so that's why the recommendation is to drop that ice down so it's closer to the cold plate.
Andy, great presentation. You mentioned that for your seltzer, you have a much higher PSI. What about like an English ale versus a American IPA versus a German or a Belgian? In your kegerator, do you have different line lengths?
That's a good question. I haven't done different line lengths for those things. And so I will generally serve with the same line length, just more from a practical purpose. But I think if I was serving a lot of those beers, I might, decide, hey, I've got a tap that has a different line length than those other ones. So right now, it's just, for me, it's the seltzer. I've got the seltzer tap that's got a different line length, and I've got all the other taps that are doing the same thing.
So all the other ones are sort of a happy medium, 2.5 PSI or something?
Yeah, six foot length, and they all run at, and everything's at the same temperature, 6 foot length, but even if the beer is carved a little bit differently, then...
There's certain fluctuation that'll even out. Thank you.
Yeah.
So in relation to the water versus ice on the jockey boxes, one thing that's important is on a coil jockey box is to run beer through there before you add the ice. And it's not a huge deal on wider coils, but I've had some problems on thinner coils where I thought I had run enough, and turns out it was like there's still a little bit of liquid in there, and it's like the biggest problem was on one of the wild barrel ones where it had been designed to be maybe a 3/4-inch coil for a while, and then drop down to like an 1/8-inch coil for the end to give extra restriction. And that froze up, and then that's a pain because you've got to warm it up with water and get it to melt, and you don't want to get ice crystals in there. And then I had a unique issue to solve with my outdoor kegerator. So my outdoor setup is a mini fridge underneath a bar with about 4 inches of concrete and a little air gap above that, and then into a tower mounted to the outside bar. So the way I solved that was I ran 3 3/4-inch copper pipes wrapped in insulation up into the tower and left maybe 3 inches in the top of the tower as the cooled area. And then each line goes through one of the pipes, and then the third pipe is hooked up to a blower system. And so the blower is blowing cold air up into the tower and then back down through the gap in those lines and keeps the whole thing cold.
Yeah, you know, and you can even do that with airflow. You can even do that within, say, your Keyser setup, because even in a Keyser setup, you'll have, and normally you put the taps up on the higher end of that. Yes, there's going to be a temperature gradient even in your Keyser setup, and so having airflow is something that can reduce the temperature gradient. But you know, that whole thing that Chris is bringing up about cooling the towers and is really important, and how you do that. If you're going to have towers in your serving system, how you do that can make a difference. I'm glad you brought up the point about basically priming the system with beer first before you add the ice into it, and I recommend doing that even with the cold plates, but because it is so much of a pain, as you know, so much of a pain if you end up getting ice crystals under and it's clogged, and you have to try to figure out how to take the system or get all the ice out of there and warm it up, and you just don't want to do that. So just let a little bit of liquid go through first, and then dump all your ice on it, and you'll be safe if you do that.
So one quick comment about the cold plate. So Andy mentioned ice. So with mine, I actually use big ice packs. I got some big ice packs that came with a food delivery, and I find that if I put a piece of aluminum foil above the cold plate, because the cold plate has a real rough texture on it, I don't want to puncture the bag of the ice pack at all. Do that and then put the ice pack down there. I haven't had any problems with cooling, but again, your mileage may vary on that, so that may be something to experiment with if you're using a cold plate.
That's a great input, and it's a really cool system that you have, Andre, there. And what I like about it is that, well, with the cold packs, you don't have to, waste any ice, and you don't have to go get ice and all the, if you're bringing these cold packs, and if that can really work,
yeah, or worry
really
about
cool.
the drain, because like you have to have yours set up so the water's constantly draining off. So I got mine from More Beer. It's one of the Kegland 2-line cold plates. And I think what makes it different than some of the other ones is, since Kegland's an Australian company, everything's in metric. So I believe it's 4mm tubing inside of it, which is smaller than yours is 1/4 inch, right, inside?
No. Oh, yeah, 1/4 inch inside.
Yeah, so
1/4 inch, they're 1/4 inch OD.
Yeah.
They measure the stainless in OD, not
so
ID.
mine is 4mm OD, so it's different, and that gives enough resistance that I can run my kegs at a much higher pressure. Andy's got to run his either a bit lower or with the extra tubing that you've put in yours. So mine literally comes into the cold plate and out to the taps. I don't have to have any of the extra coils in it.
Yeah, yours would be a great one to source if people are trying to build new cold plate systems, especially, I don't know if it comes in a four product.
I don't know.
That would be really cool if you could get that one in a 4 product, because then, you don't have to do all the tubing routing that I did in there. And if you can get a better restriction in there, you also waste less beer, in the end, so. Any other questions?
You mentioned that your your draft system is different for your seltzers. Roughly, what's different between beer and the seltzer on how you route them?
So the difference between beer and seltzer is that the beer is being carbonated at, say, 11 psi. If you're looking at 36 degrees, then the seltzer is being carbonated at 30 psi. You know, it's always 30. Sometimes I go 20 to 30. So I'll usually put 30 on it, but then I'll let it come down to 20. So I'm in the 20 to 30 range. And so basically you're a lot more, volumes of CO2 in there. And so if you look at the way that the pressure that you need to have, you have a lot more restriction that you have to have in order to get the right flow rate. So that's the difference in there. Stan has a question.
So when you're doing your seltzer, are you using two regulators or a secondary regulator to achieve two different pressures?
So I'm maybe doing things a little bit differently than what everybody else is. I've had a lot of CO2 that I've lost because I've left things hooked up, and then you get a small leak, and then it's gone. So what I normally do is I normally charge up my kegs, get them all to the pressure that I want them to be, and once they're charged, I disconnect them. And so I'll charge it at, right now I'm carbonating a new seltzer because I ran out at Lambic Brew Session. So I'm carbonating right now at 30 PSI, but when that's done, then I'll just disconnect it. And if I serve off of it a few times, then at the end of the time serving it, then I'll fill it back up. So it's maybe a different way. It's not something that you would normally do, but if you guys were at the Lambic Brew Session, none of my kegs had any CO2 on them when regulated CO2 on them when you guys were pulling off of them. It pulls off of them with whatever pressure's in there, and then I end up filling them up at the end of the day. And that works if you're not. It doesn't work if you're dispensing 18 pints of beer or something like that. But if you've got enough different beers to select from, and people are pulling, a few ounces here, a few ounces there, a few ounces there, you can do something like that. Ryan does the same thing. I can't tell you how many times you get a leak, your whole CO2 cylinder's gone. You're just like, and so it just helps to prevent that. Well, last question. We have one more time for one more question, and then we're gonna break.
Sodas and water, when you carbonate them, seem to have big bubbles where beer has fine bubbles. Any idea why?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I've heard a lot of things about how carbonation even can differ between, forced carbonation and between natural carbonation, and I really don't know. I really don't know the reason why. So, might have to do. It has probably something to do with the composition of what you're trying to carbonate. All right, we're going to take one more question.
All right, it's the
Last question.
All right, sorry. So I've made some really big imperial stouts, like 14, 15%, and they do not want to carb up. Like I can run them at 18 PSI, and it still doesn't have a lot of carbonation.
I've seen that too. I've also seen that too, where there's some really big beers and they just don't want to carb as easy. I think it might have to do with the specific gravity of the beer that the final gravity of the beer that you're serving.
So do you have a solution for that?
If you want it to carb, you're gonna probably be turning the pressure up higher to have it. I don't have a
Keep turning it up.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Keep turning it up. Let me know how it goes. All right. Thank you all.
All right, let's give a big. There you go.